right, everybody, today we are going to start our next unit. We're going to start looking at biology, and specifically today we are going to talk about something called biodiversity. All right, so here we go. So the question is, just to start off with, well, what is biodiversity? What does that word mean? Well, biodiversity means the number of species, the number of individuals per species in a given geographic area. Now, what that means is basically what are all the different fungi, the different insects, the different plants, the different bacteria, mammals, reptiles, etc., 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 that might be living in a specific area. In other words, we are talking about the variety of life in a specific area. Okay? Now, why is it important? Well, biodiversity is what allows systems to adapt to changing circumstances over time. So if something in the environment changes, biodiversity will allow the organisms that live in that area to be able to survive, adapt, and change, and be able to get past whatever that change was. Now, we also can use biodiversity as a way to gauge how healthy a biological system is. So we can look at a particular area, and we can look at how many different species of organisms there are there. And from that, we can determine, is this a healthy place? Is this a healthy system? Or is it maybe in danger of there being some problems in the future? All right? So why, though, is it important? What does that mean as far as what the strength or the health of an ecosystem is? Well, let's think back to what you would have learned in grade 7, grade 8. You would have learned about what are called food chains. So we've got maize or corn that could be eaten by a locust, and that locust could be eaten by a lizard, and that lizard could be eaten by a snake. Now, this is a very simple little relationship. This is eaten by this. This is eaten by this. This is eaten by this. And this isn't really eaten by anything. So if you think back and remember what you would have learned, this corn or maize is what we would call a producer. And we call it a producer because it's able to make its own energy from the sun. Whereas these guys here are what are called consumers. They need to eat something else in order to get energy. So the locust has to eat the corn to get energy. The lizard has to eat the locust to get energy. The snake has to eat the lizard to get energy. Okay? So this snake, because it's not eaten by anything, is often called the top carnivore. And it's called the top carnivore because nothing eats it, so it's on top. And it's a carnivore because it eats other animals or other insects. All right? So let's look at something that you may or may not have seen before. So we've got over here what's called a food web. All right? So on the right, we have another food chain. On the left, we have a food web. Well, let's take a look at this compared to this. In this on the right-hand side, it's the same as what we would have seen on the previous slide. We have the energy coming from the sun, and we have our producer right at the bottom. All right? Now, in this case, it's what's called a dinoflagellate, and those are just small little microscopic organisms. That can be eaten by what are called copepods, which are other very, very small organisms. But these guys can be eaten by what are called sunfish. And if you don't know anything about sunfish are massive. Sunfish can be, several hundred kilograms. They're huge, huge fish. So we have, from the beginning, we have the energy from the sun that's being turned into usable energy by these producers, these tiny little organisms, which are eaten by other tiny little organisms, but we're getting bigger and bigger as we go up the scale. So we've got these sunfish that can then eat them, and then we have small shark that can then eat the sunfish, because even though these small shark are smaller, they are predators. They are carnivores. They like to eat fish, so they're going to eat the sunfish, but there's always a bigger fish. Or in this case, there's always a bigger shark. So we've got large shark up here, which would be our top carnivore. All right, so we've got producers at the bottom, consumer, 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 and you may have seen these terms before. Primary consumer means they are the first consumer, so that means they eat a producer. Secondary means they are the second consumer, and that means they eat a primary consumer. Now, in a food chain, it's pretty easy to figure out. So we've got producer, first consumer, second consumer, third consumer, fourth, and it just goes in a straight line. But real life doesn't look like this, or at least it doesn't look like this in most places. Real life looks more like this, where there could be multiple organisms that get energy from the sun. So I could have in this same space, and you'll notice that these organisms are also found in here, we can have both dinoflagellates or what are called diatoms. So we've got two different kinds of tiny little organisms that can get energy from the sun. And they could be eaten by shrimp, or they could be eaten by copepods, or they could be eaten by pteropods. And these could be eaten by lanternfish, or amphipods, or ocean sunfish. So you can see on this side we had the dinoflagellates, copepods, sunfish, small shark, large shark. If you look over here, we have the sun, dinoflagellates, copepods, sunfish, small shark, large shark. Right? So within this web, we still have this chain, but there are a lot of different other things that could eat other things. So let's think about something. What would happen if one of the species in this food chain was completely wiped out? Like say there was some sort of disease that killed all the ocean sunfish. Well, what's going to happen to all the small shark? And what's going to happen to all the copepods? Well, the small shark suddenly lose their food. So that means all the small shark are going to die because they're going to starve. And because the large shark have to eat the small shark, that means all the large shark are going to die as well. And these copepods normally get eaten by sunfish. Now there's nothing to eat them. So suddenly these copepods can grow out of control. But then all of these copepods need food, which means they are going to slowly wipe out all the dinoflagellates because they need more and more food. And then what happens if all of these are gone? Well, you can see that losing just one of the things in this chain can have a devastating effect. If you lose one, you probably lose them all. But if we were to lose the sunfish in this food web, you can see that if the sunfish goes away, well, the copepods are still being eaten by these amphipods and these lanternfish, and the smaller shark eats ocean sunfish, but they also eat tuna. They also eat squid. They also eat lancetfish. All right, so if we lose one organism in a food web, it's going to have an effect, but it should probably still survive. If we lose one organism in a food chain, it's going to have a drastic effect. All right, so this is where the importance of biodiversity comes in. This does not have much biodiversity. This does. Okay? So, what kind of threats are there to biodiversity? How can these areas or these groups of organisms be affected? Well, we'll commonly see the acronym HIPPO to describe it. And we're going to add in another one right at the end. All right? So here are some of the common threats to biodiversity. Number one is habitat loss. So, a lake could disappear, or a river dry up, or there could be a forest that burns or is cut down. All right? So there are a number of different ways that habitat could be lost. The second is invasive species. So what that means is other species of organisms that move into that area that could maybe kill a lot of the organisms that live there. The third is pollution. The fourth is population growth. And when we say population growth, we're specifically talking about human population growth. The fifth is overconsumption. So eating too many of the organisms that are in that area. And the last one is the cumulative impact of any of these other effects and climate change. Now, if you take a look at these, you should notice a bit of a pattern here. There are 5 of those 6 who are pretty much on us. So habitat loss could come from farms being built or cities spreading out. Pollution, that's a pretty self-explanatory one. Our human population growth is going to have an effect. We have to eat more, and that leads to overconsumption. So we end up eating more and more of those plants and animals. And then we have the cumulative effect of all of these and climate change. This is all on us. And even the invasive species is still sometimes us. It could come naturally. There could be species that just migrate and move to a different area. But that often comes from an effect, or is often an effect of climate change. It forces species to move. And when that happens, organisms are introduced to a new area and sometimes wreak havoc. Or it could come in the form of, and this has happened fairly frequently, where organisms are on ships or on crates of materials that are being transferred from one part of the world to another, and they end up accidentally introduced into some other area, and they start growing and spreading quickly. Again, that's sometimes on us. So out of these 6 threats, these 6 major threats, 5 of them are definitely us, and 1 of them is sometimes us. So obviously, we are a major issue here. Now, why do we care? What difference does it make if, ocean sunfish are wiped out? Well, biodiversity actually provides functioning ecosystems that, number 1, supply oxygen. That's something we need. If they supply clean air and water, something we need. They control pests. That's something we like. They provide medicine. That's something we both need and like. They provide food, something we need. They regulate climate, which is something we actually do need. All of this is just stuff that actually specifically directly impacts us. All right, there are a number of other reasons that biodiversity is important, specifically to these organisms. And while, we think of ourselves as the most important aspect of it, they're still important as well, and they do deserve some sort of consideration. But even if all we do is consider how it impacts us, this is just the beginning of the number of ways that biodiversity is incredibly important to us as human beings. So that leads us to what is called ecosystems. So that'll be our next topic in the next lesson. No homework for this one. All you've got to do is understand it. If you have any questions, let me know. And if you're ready, go on to the next